Ooh, here we are, and we have something up here, but let's take it down really quick. Where did this go? Whoa, 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 whoa. Everybody gets to see everything. Let's take it down. Okay. Hello, everybody. We have a great episode, a great broadcast here about space. You just got to see a whole host of some really cool content that's coming to talk about the industry of industries in a lot of ways. We're going to talk about space. So I've talked about this a lot, and I continue to talk about it because space is a thing, an industry, a place, a concept, a frontier that really, really, really matters. There's really no other way to say it. In a lot of ways, space is the final frontier. All the shows, all the Star Wars, all the Star Trek is not far off. And we are in a really crazy time for the space industry because we just have so many changes going on. We have so much transformation. At the same time, within the technological sector, within the labor market, within the capital markets, within the access to international inputs, with the war going on, with the breakdown of everything, it is so chaotic, but it's also very dynamic. And we got to talk about this. So what are we going to talk about today? First, of course, who am I? My name is Jason Sheftel. I am a specialist on China, on international development, on business, and how to basically make your way through this really chaotic time we're in. So I'm on here trying to share some of my knowledge and wisdom and insight with anybody and everybody. That's what we do on here, and what I'm trying to do in the community we're building is one where people get to see a little farther into the future and get to have a sense for where things are really going and why and what to pay attention to. That's really one of the key things we have today is our attention. It is our ability to focus on the right thing and to put our energy into it. That is what we have, right? We're in a world of entertainment machines and entertainment engines that are just going to be sucking us in and trying to get us to focus on all sorts of things. But we need to know what to focus on. So that's what we're here to talk about today. And there is a lot of good content you can see. You go back, you'll see I have a bunch of videos on space, some cool stuff about Elon Musk, about Chinese space stations and Chinese rockets and where things are going and the reality of European integration. We'll touch on all sorts of things like that today. But this channel isn't just about space. This is a combination of a history of why things happened, which countries win, which countries develop, which technologies matter, which businesses are the best ones to be invested in, which is worth building. That is what we're talking about. And on the deepest level, we're also talking about people. What does it mean to be in this world? What does it mean to be part of a nation or a religious group or a certain ethnicity? There is a lot more to this, and the art, psychology, and culture that goes with it. It doesn't not matter. And at the highest level, all of the nations around us, they all have something like a personality. So the French nation has a somewhat French personality. So does the Russian one, so does the Chinese one, so does the American one. And this isn't a world for stereotypes. This is a place where we have to really understand what a country is and why it became that way. So I'm really excited to share that pretty soon I'm going to have a course out to give my first attempt to describe a lot of this to people. And it's going to be really exciting. It's going to go through everything. It's going to go through geography. It's going to go through history and politics, economics, the technologies that matters, competition between nations, where we are today and where we're headed. Really excited. Anybody interested, I will throw in the description of the video, of this video and this live stream, just a link to get access to this when it first comes out, to get access to it even before it comes out. That's what we're going to do. So there's a lot of cool stuff coming that's not even here on YouTube, or at least you'll only see pieces of it here on YouTube. But there's also a lot of great stuff right on here. So one really great thing is just some of the recent content I've been able to put out and create for everybody. There is some really cool stuff. Oh, I'm trying to get a picture for you guys later, but right now, there we go. Right, so there's some really cool stuff. Just recently, there's been an episode about, a broadcast about deflation. And deflation matters, and I don't like to go too much into economics for too long. Like, economics always will come up. Economics is part of what it means to be a human being. And it's definitely what happens, and it's just part of the fabric of life when you're part of a large human group, when you're part of a global economy, or even just a person in a city, a person in a state. You need to understand economics. It comes out in everything. It's going to come out a bit in this whole video about space. And there's a whole sector, there's a whole industry, there's a whole group of companies and technologies that are here in a labor force, and we have to understand it. And economics is one of those things that gives us such a good read on things. But you got to pay attention to current events. There's also a lot here about what's going on. Like, I know everybody is very excited about Nancy Pelosi going to Taiwan, or preparing to go to Taiwan. This has been going on for a couple months. There's been indications that a bunch of senators might go. Nancy Pelosi got sick, or there was some other reason she didn't go before. China's not having it. We have a war in Ukraine. Could we have the same thing in Taiwan? There's a lot going on. Everybody wants the information about that, so there'll definitely be content about that. But right now, this is the start of something really cool. This episode is going to be a segue into a week that is going to be, it's going to be themed. We're going to be in Industry Week. This is going to be a week about the industries that matter. Some of them, can't do all of them, but we got to know what matters, right? We always talk about industry and manufacturing and technology, but we don't know which of these matter. We don't know which to focus on. There's too much. So I'm going to try and bring a little bit of order to it, a little bit of history, and a little bit of just a bit more structure. So this is the start of it, and space is really a great segue here. Who can deny that this is one of the coolest industries there is? And I'm not just here talking about it because it's cool. It's also really something that matters. And there's no way to be a modern country without a great space sector, without having access to the technologies that are enabled in space, or basically only access through space. It's a real thing. And we're seeing that in the news right now. So people don't know, Russia's currently in a war with Ukraine, and the Russian equivalent of GPS, something called GLONASS, is garbage. It's terrible. Russian planes are flying with like Garmin units inside of them because the Russian GLONASS systems are so horrible. They're so mediocre, they're so unreliable that they can't even conduct the sort of operations they would need. They don't have the fidelity of positioning and navigation to even do it. It's really that bad. And everyone's known for a long time that a lot of Russian industry is rusting away. I've said that for a long time, so many people. But in particular, the space stuff has been really, really bad. There's actually, let me pull it up for everybody. There was recently an addition to the International Space Station. Oh, here you go. International Space Station. Ooh, that didn't work. Oh. Let's give it a second here. Oh, this might just load it in a really intense way right onto my face. But there's a recent addition. Yep, there it is. Let's do this. Ooh. Take this down here. There you go. So this is the NACA. Forgive my Russian pronunciation there. This is the NACA module to the International Space Station. This has been in development since like the 1990s. And it took Russia so long just to even get it attached to the space station. There was problems. It took them so long that they ran out of parts. They didn't have the tools they needed to actually build the parts or maintain the systems, and things rusted away, and then they didn't have them. It was just a disaster from the start. And then once it attaches even to the space station, it became even more of a problem. It started firing its thrusters uncontrollably, and it caused a huge problem. It could have caused serious damage to the space station. It was a disaster. And this isn't just one thing. This is many things. There are Russian rockets flying up with holes in them. And basically the kind of war you're seeing, that is what a lot of Russian industry looks like writ large. And this is kind of what I'm talking about earlier on, about nations having personalities and focusing on certain things, not caring so much about this, not caring so much about precision, and just focusing on like getting a lot of things that are sturdy and can sort of make it. That works if you're building tanks. It does not work if you're building really intricate space systems. It is a recipe for disaster, basically. And that is what's happening throughout Russia. But it's not just Russia, it's also Ukraine. Ukraine is having just as bad a time. Ukraine does not have, actually, interestingly enough, Ukraine has a huge, huge history in space. The Eastern Ukraine had a very, very important place and role in the Russian space sector, the Soviet space sector. That was a major part of it. a lot of the key facilities, key firms, key industrial centers, and design bureaus, they were all located in Ukraine. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine actually had a lot of the capacity to build some of Russia's most advanced rockets. And it's a big reason actually why Russia hasn't really developed a modern, functional rocket since the fall of the Soviet Union. That's actually a fact, right? They have this thing called Ankara, which is terrible. It is so outdated and so broken and so misdesigned, or not misdesigned, I mean, again, it's just like that thing that was attached to the space station. It's been in development for like 25 years, and times have moved on, and Russian capacity has fallen during this period. So its ability to even execute on plans it had in the 90s is really dubious at best. So this is it, Russia. I mean, Ukraine it had that capacity, but it doesn't have now operational communication satellites or imaging satellites or really internet data capacity, satellite internet. I mean, this is a big reason why you saw the story of SpaceX sending over to Ukraine a huge amount of different Starlink terminals. But what it was basically doing was recreating the capacity that the Ukraine didn't have, that it would actually need to try and function in case the electrical and internet systems in Ukraine were totally destroyed. And crazily enough, the Ukrainian electrical sector was actually maintained for various reasons. Europe really managed to integrate it really quick, but the whole system, a lot of the infrastructure in Ukraine was maintained. But still, to fight a war, any kind of war, you need really basic. I mean, you don't need basic. You need really sophisticated satellite systems and space systems. There's really no other way to do it unless you're fighting a really old school sort of war. But Ukraine doesn't have it, and it had to really rely on the United States, on Western nations, and on commercial partners. One of the craziest things about the war we're seeing is that this is the first open source war, you could say. We are seeing the mass use of commercial satellite imaging for military, operational, tactical, and strategic activities. This has never been done before. So basically, starting in the 90s, you had this huge explosion of commercial satellites, commercial satellite systems. They're used for all sorts of things. They were used for all sorts of things, and they've really developed. And we now have better rockets, smaller, more advanced, but still very capable satellites. And you're able to build these amazing systems, and you're able to have them operated by individual companies that can then sell it to different nations. That's not how it used to work. That's not how it worked. This, as we'll get into, space is something very different. This was a military arena. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. So that's it. Ukraine doesn't have launch vehicles, doesn't have the communications or any of these things. And this matters. Space is in the news. Space really matters. And it's also there in China. So anybody watching this channel, China's a big thing. China is something I'm always talking about because for millennials in particular, China was this reincarnation of the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany or any other large, big, bad country that America was trying to prepare to combat. Truth is, the United States has been the top dog for over 100 years, and it kind of just needs to create an enemy. But for anyone who grew up, particularly millennials in the 90s, 2000s, 2010s, you grew up seeing China as this rising star and trying to understand China, what's going to happen, what has happened. This makes a really big difference. This makes a big difference to understanding what is going on in the world, what can happen and what can't. And I'm always going to bring up China. It is the great reference point because you can't really talk about the United States and any other country anymore. It's just, the gap is too large. You know, the United States pulled away from Japan a long time ago, but definitively in the 90s, and Japan is smaller in terms of its economy today than it was in 1996. So that's not really a competition, and Japan's the next largest economy in the world. So things are really far different than we usually think about, but that is where we're at. So space matters, and I'm going to be putting out all sorts of videos about space, about other really important hard tech sectors, because for anyone who's just joining in, this is about the industries that matter, the industries of the future, the technologies that are going to actually change things versus be ones that are just part of the hype cycle to get you invested and involved and to take your money or do whatever the guys with their hand in the pot are trying to do. We're really looking for the things that move civilization forward, and unfortunately a lot of these technologies don't move super quick. So actually, one second here. I'll be right. All right, we will get right back to it. So this is about that, right? And space is one of these technologies. It is one of these sectors, one of these industries that is absolutely crucial. And I brought up Ukraine, I brought up Russia, I brought up their failures, their limitations, I brought up China's ambitions, because this is part of the world we're in. And this is, again, that final frontier. The United States would lose its mind if China suddenly had a moon base, a lunar moon base. The entire country would go crazy. It would be like Sputnik again, right? And what's going on a bit in the American administration and both political parties is an attempt to galvanize the United States to start moving again like it did in the space race, to start to get its mojo back, or at least a mojo it thinks it doesn't have anymore. And that's something else for different videos. You should check out some other stuff I have about this, about the new space race, what it really means, what it's about. But this stuff is really important. And today is just a monologue about space. It's about where it's going, where it's at, where it's been, all that, and really where it's headed. So I'm going to go on for a while here. It's been a really great day for me in a lot of ways, and I need to get a lot out of my chest. So this is the world that we're in, and here's the truth. Just people want to know. You think there's inequality in the world. That's definitely true. The space sector, the space industry is so unequal, it is going to blow your mind, right? To get into space, you need to have everything else. So you can imagine the entire we have like agriculture at the bottom, hunter-gatherers, and you add newer technologies. You add industrialization, all these transportation technologies and chemicals and petrochemicals and and then finally you get like electricity, digital technology, then finally also at the top you get space. You get the space sector, you get the ability to move out of Earth's atmosphere, out of the physical geography and planetary geography of the planet that we appeared on. It's quite a crazy thing, but you need everything. You need metallurgy, you need electronics, you need all the other things, you need engines, systems integration, all the software skills. It's really tough, and only the big boys in the world really get to play. Everybody else is just being cute, and we're just going to get into it, right? So this is the story of the great powers in space, and we got to remember always at first, space was originally a military domain. This is not a place for countries that think war is this or that, or don't have real space sectors, don't have real militaries. You're not likely to have a major space sector because you don't have the forcing function pulling you into this game. All right, so I'm going to pull up a image for everybody really quick here. Let's do this. Let's see how big this is. Okay. Let's see what we see here. Okay, cool. We'll see how big this gets. Oh, here we go. It's not that bad. This is from Bryce. This is a space consultancy. They are really good, so obviously credit to them. I'll just put it over my face. You guys don't have to look at me. So this is a picture of the global space economy, right? This is the breakdown of it, and unfortunately it's pretty patchy. But the gist of what I want you to see is that this is this is getting close to a $400 billion industry, and this is an industry that Bank of America, other places see. They're saying it's going to be $1 trillion industry, and the really important thing to know is that most of the brown, almost all of this is just satellites. A few other things. Most of it, there's a lot of military funding there, but I want to give you a sense of the scale of the industry. And it is big. It's a big deal. And there's three main sectors. There's really launch, satellites, and ground systems. There's a lot of variety in all of them. So launch vehicles, you have like really big launch vehicles, which are really big rockets. They have different payload capacities. Many of them are targeted to different orbits. So that is all variety that you see in the launch sector. But the truth is, you don't make any money in launch. Launch is just how you get things up in orbit. And what really matters are satellites. And satellites come in all sorts of sizes themselves. There's imaging, communications, there's scientific satellites, there's positional, navigational satellites. There's also war satellites, a little not as well hidden as people think, but there are definitely satellites up there that are meant to do some nasty things. And here's the crazy part. We're talking about all the stuff that space can do. We're talking about a $400+ billion industry. That chart could easily have been from a couple years ago. And a lot of this stuff is also in the black budget of a lot of countries. So you add up what isn't there, and it's even bigger than you think. So, but you look at all this, and there's like basically 200 nations-ish in the world. 7 countries can independently bring anything up into space. That's right, 7. It's actually that bad. And who are we talking about? Well, basically, we're talking about the United States, Russia, China, Japan, and then Israel, Iran, kinda. Iran is a bit shaky there. It's kind of like Russia. It's kind of dubious. And then broadly speaking, the EU, but really we're talking about France. So Britain can't do this. Germany can't do this. Ukraine can't do this. South Korea is trying to do this, but can't do this. Most of the world, most of the advanced industrial world can't bring things into space. We think everybody can do it. If you're an American, you just assume, you're like, why is NASA so pathetic? Why is it costing so much money? Go into space. Go to the moon. Why are you wasting our time? Get there right now. It's like no other country on Earth even tries to do this. And the amount of money NASA spends, get into it a little bit, is really insane. But here we got to really understand something important. The United States created the situation. I said that space is a military and strategic arena. The United States lost its mind when Sputnik went into space. It thought it was doomed. It thought there were communist satellites orbiting the Earth, watching everything going on. And the United States freaked out and just went for broke and went to the moon in like 10 years. That is what happened. And ever since then, the United States has been totally dominant in space, and it is very vulnerable. There's not a lot of ways to come to the United States. You have to make it past the Atlantic Ocean, past the Pacific Ocean. You have to either go all the way through Canada, all the way through Mexico. It's a really tough thing to even touch the United States. So when things like 9/11 happen, bad news, the United States freaks out. When things like Sputnik happen, space is one of those areas like cyber where you can touch the United States without being there physically. And so the United States freaks out. And it is very defensive, very prepared to take excess reaction and use excess force to really deal with any perceived threat that comes from space. And so part of what it's been doing for the last 40 years is explicitly limiting the capacity of all of its allies to even independently get to space, just in case. Just in case, right? So everyone else was made dependent as much as possible on the United States. So Britain just sends its things up on American rockets, and that's how it is. The country, of course, that kind of bucked this trend would be France. France is always there, thwarting American attempts to make it dependent on them and to basically make all of Europe just an American satellite. The French are they're too proud for anything like that to really ever be allowed entirely, right? Or at least not without a fight, not without a lot of sass and snark. That's the way it goes. But this doesn't even matter anymore, right? I said there are 7 countries. I said the EU and I said France, but it's kind of weird. To make an independent space launch capability in Europe, it's been a project really got going in the 80s, and it actually started because of the loss of that original space shuttle, and there was a whole entrance. And basically the only reason that Russia and France and China are even in the space market in a major way is because of things that happened in the 80s and 90s that kind of let them get a toehold in and then really leverage it to move really far. And that's kind of what you actually see in a lot of industries everywhere in the second half of the 20th century. That's what you see in auto with the German and the Japanese success in the American market. Yeah, the Americans were really, those car companies weren't building products that customers wanted, et cetera, then read the market. But also, you just have this moment where things just start moving and a foreign company or foreign country or foreign competitor gets in and is able to just totally focus its efforts on those markets and really succeed. So there's a similar thing that happened in space, but all that is going to break down. And a big reason why is because space is insanely expensive. Insanely expensive. Like, it really boggles the mind. Like this new NASA rocket, I'll show you guys an image of this rocket here. This new NASA rocket, which finally got a launch date for August. Let's see. This rocket is so expensive, it almost really does almost boggle the mind. Well, here's a version of it that isn't even, whatever. I'll show you guys this one. So this is the space launch system. This is all the different pieces of it. That doesn't really matter all that much right now. But this is a big rocket. This thing is like really big. I actually can't remember how many stories it is, but it's massive. And it costs over $1 billion, probably over $2 billion just to launch this rocket once. And truth be told, there's a lot of very creative accounting going on. The full cost of this rocket, which has 2 other rockets and all of these companies building it and all taking their cut, it is insane. It is larger than the space budget of most countries. Just launching this rocket is that expensive. And it's a failure of a rocket, to be honest. It's a total, unfortunately, for a lot of reasons, it's been a waste of a lot of money. But even the fact the US is willing to spend that money, most countries don't have that money. They don't even have anywhere close to that money that they can just expend on a space system, on a space industry, on a space agency, on really any of these investments. So what we're really seeing in a lot of ways is a lot of countries, they need to have a global space industry. We actually need the US to be spending money to make it possible. Without the United States, there isn't enough capital in the entire world that gets put to space to build out something like what we have now. And that's a crazy thing, and that's actually very common in a lot of industries, but it really matters in space because we're talking about all these things that space does, all of these really powerful capabilities. Well, for this whole thing to work, you need the United States. Now, that rocket doesn't really matter as much, but there are, well, let me show you guys a quick, no, we won't show you that. I won't show you the Chinese stuff. Well, I'll leave that for a second. We'll go right back to where things are. So the point of all this, of all of these rockets, there's millions of rockets, and there's not millions of rockets, there's all these different rockets, and they're very important. But the whole purpose of a rocket, the only reason rockets were invented, basically ballistic missiles, the reason ballistic missiles were originally transformed into space launch vehicles, which is just a ballistic missile that goes into space instead of going back down, originally at least. They're more complex now, but that's the gist of it. The reason they exist is satellites. It is all about satellites. So I showed you that graph, that chart earlier from Bryce, and I have another one, I believe. Let's give you the other. Let's see this. Is this the same one? Yeah, here you go. So there's another chart from Bryce. So we had 360-ish billion before for the entire space sector. Now we just have the satellite sector. It's that much, right? It is that big a part of the entire space industry. Basically, most of the space industry is the satellite sector. Here you can see there's ground equipment, there's satellite services, there's manufacturing, and there's launch. Launch is like a very, very, very tiny part of everything here. Anyway, this might be an older graph that's actually showing the whole sector, but the point again is look at the tiny percentage, that's 2% launch. You have manufacturing and satellite services, which are 50% by themselves. And then you have ground equipment, which is actually an industry that's really transforming. So the point being, the only way to make money, the whole point of all this is satellites. Ground equipment is just the ground infrastructure you need to receive all of the communication, the data, and the information coming from the satellites. That's what ground, it is basically the satellites connecting infrastructure on the ground. So basically the entire thing, 98% of the entire space industry is just about satellites. And even the rockets, they're just there to send satellites up. It's a satellite industry at heart. So the reason you have, projections of $1 trillion industry is because there's huge potential growth in the satellite sector. The sort of services you can provide with modern satellites, with the new satellite manufacturing capabilities, with the increased power, potential, scale, and reach and reusability of all these new rockets, which we're going to get into, there's just a massive transformation going on right now. And the ground systems are actually mostly boring. The whole story there is basically it's being transformed into a cloud infrastructure, right? Old school ground, the reason there's so much money in this part of the industry is because the ground services, it used to be very, those big towers, those big domes, and they were taking in the, all the signals, and it was very complicated, but now it's all being digitized. It's actually all moving to the cloud. And there's certain concerns about this. In the military sector, they're very worried about all sorts of things, but they're going to partner with Microsoft or Amazon or Google and whatever and provide this cloud infrastructure, just like they do to enterprise clients. I actually find it very boring, but hey, if anyone actually thinks there's more going on, feel free to reach out to me, because convince me otherwise, I'd be very happy to be proven I'm wrong. But what do these satellites do? What is the space sector? Well, these satellites provide us all sorts of stuff. There's satellite TV, there's GPS, there's satellite internet, there's commercial imagery, there's endless military uses, and this is what you get with the space sector. it actually makes all of the applications. So many things on your phone require GPS. All the location services, every single thing actually. Google Maps. So many of the apps and the services that we take for granted on a daily basis. The baseline infrastructure for them requires the massive space investments. Most of the whole GPS system was originally funded by the U.S. military. It was for their needs, basically to get people and guns and information and everything to where it needed to go. And let me actually show you guys. Let's see if I can bring this. Ooh, is this going to work? Here we go. This is actually an image of the latest version of the GPS house. This is GPS 3 satellite. These are made, I believe, by Lockheed Martin, and they're really cool. And these are geostationary satellites, so they're really far up in space. In another episode, another video or broadcast, I will show you guys. I could talk more about the geostationary orbits, but just to give you guys a sense of how kind of fantastic this is. Right here is a, I'd really like to get, well, either way, the point of this is that this is what it looks like actually. So what this is an image of is one sec, let's get rid of this. So this is an image of what it takes to get global coverage from 3 geostationary satellites. Geostationary satellites basically are satellites that they stay stationary and they basically look at the same point on the Earth at all times. And so and they're very far out. They're very far away from the Earth. Their orbit is very distant. Like the radius is far from the center of the Earth, basically, compared to low Earth orbit satellites, or there's various different orbits. And this is a really distant one. And what it lets you do is see the entire world. You get this huge, huge surface area that you can cover, and you look at it all the time. And this really gorgeous map is an image of what that looks like. And actually, people who don't know, orbital mechanics especially for sort of the mathy dudes, or people who even like a lot of pattern stuff. Let me show you. I'll show you something actually really cool. Yeah, let's see if we can get this here. All right, so check this out, guys. I think this is really cool. So right here, let's pull this up. Go to the beginning here. Okay. Yeah, so let me pull this out for you guys. So let me start it. This is an image of, so what is happening here? This is a map of what the orbits of Venus and the Earth look like, kind of linked together like this as they circle the sun. And they naturally create all sorts of really intricate patterns. You guys are probably thinking about fractals and mandalas and all this kind of stuff. And that is the right train of thought to follow. So all of these orbits, if you really map them out and you put lines and you actually visualize what they look like, they're doing crazy things. It's really stunning. And these satellites all around the Earth are actually doing, not quite in this way, but they're doing similar things. There's a really crazy stellar beauty to the way that all of this actually works up in space. And there really should be a series. I don't know, maybe if anybody's interested, I'll try and find or maybe create a sort of thing that gives people a better sense for what this looks like, because it's really a stunning thing, and it is something we need because space is really cool, and to get interested in it, it really opens up this whole world to you. So I've been talking about how big the space sector is, the projections for what it will look like in the future, and all that is true. But even more, this is the final frontier in a lot of ways, and you need to have a passion for space if you want to have a real passion for humanity, civilization, whatever you want to call it. And there's a big battle going on right now about the American billionaires, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, who are pouring their money into space to try and move things forward, but also to kind of get glory for themselves. And there's a huge battle about whether billionaires should be wasting their money in space or whatever it happens to be. And you can think what you want about all this, but the really cool thing here is that we have progress in space, which is not something we've had for a while. So when I said that the U.S., space ties the military together, the U.S. doesn't want anybody to be able to muscle in on space. It's very vulnerable to space, and so it doesn't want other countries to be able to go out and touch it. It doesn't want Iran to have a bunch of satellites in the air that are circling over the United States that could have weapons in them. It doesn't want North Korea to do that. It doesn't want anybody to be able to do that, truly. And this is why the U.S. has try to keep everyone out of the game. And most countries have accepted this. In Britain, Germany, Italy, everybody has gotten with the program. Kind of, they don't really have a choice because the expenses are so high, and the U.S. has provided an offering. And it's really hard to justify creating your own indigenous space launch and satellite, manufacturing and servicing capability outside of national strategic autonomy, security, and all these sorts of questions. And a place like Britain doesn't really need to think about that. And a lot of countries really feel like they didn't have to. They're proven wrong, but that's kind of beside the point. The money was so extreme, the offer was good enough that most people just took it. Most countries just took it. And the downside to this was that the US space sector, as a result, really stagnated for a long time. And that was fine for sort of a long time, but in the early 2000s and then really progressing the last 20 years, there's been a massive explosion in the capabilities of the American, in particular, space sector. And so a bunch of new American space companies have come out, and they've changed the game. And a lot of people thought, oh, this would democratize access to space, and many countries will now have rockets, and they'll all have reusable rockets, and it's going to be a really great thing. And that is not what happened. So countries like Germany and Spain and all sorts of countries, like a lot of countries that don't have any industry in a lot of ways even, they're all trying to create rockets now because it became really sexy after SpaceX both created the Falcon 9 rocket, then landed the Falcon 9 rocket, made it reusable, and is now moving on to a super heavy launch vehicle that will be fully reusable. This is a massive transformation in the whole space industry. And what it's doing is it's reasserting to everybody, it's reconfirming to everybody how important space is, and how if you let the United States have this capacity and nobody else, you are now so far behind, you don't even know where you are anymore. You really don't even know if you're even in the game. And the truth is you're really not. I mean, new space writ large, this is a term used, basically a marketing journalist term, to describe all of these new space companies. There's companies like, the big one is really SpaceX. The other ones include Firefly, Blue Origin, which is extremely well funded. That's the Jeff Bezos company. There's one called Terran. There's many, many others. There's not one called Terran. There's one called Relativity, which is producing a series of rockets called, named Terran 1, Terran R, all that. There's many companies. And there's Astra. There's all these companies, and I don't want to get into all of them because there's going to be a bloodbath soon enough with all these companies for a lot of reasons. But the key thing here is that this whole swath of companies, the ones that are actually going to make it, are almost all entirely American. No other country has the labor capacity, the tech capacity, the labor size and skill set, or the capital depth, and really just the overall market structure, with the government participating but not dominating in a lot of ways, with both a government civilian space agency and a government defense national security space agency. Basically, there's a military space sector people don't talk about in the United States, and then there's a civilian space sector headed by NASA, which is open and transparent. Those two aren't the same thing, and they provide a massive boost to any company that is trying to form a space, any group of people that is trying to form a successful space company. Let me show you really quick. This is something, so nowhere else do you have this. There's a map of NASA testing centers. So what's basically going on here is that this is infrastructure that was primarily built out during the Cold War, during the space race, when NASA was created because the United States flipped out and felt it had to find some way to one up the Soviet Union, or it was going to basically lose its mind. And you see all of these facilities all across the country that a bunch of space companies have access to. They can use these facilities. NASA has become a partner to all of these companies to give them testing facilities and data and access to really high quality scientific and technical personnel. People have really been working on spacecraft and missions and scientific instruments and rockets for a really long time. It's not something you have in any other country. And that gives America, it's one of many things that gives America an amazing leg up against anyone else. And it really isn't just NASA. But this market structure stuff is really important because getting a rocket company to succeed is difficult because it all depends on the satellite market, and that gets very complicated. So what we've had as a result of all this new space, as a result of all this new money and new initiative and new enterprises appearing in the space industry is an explosion of innovation. And it's really been catalyzed by SpaceX. There's a lot of ways that people try and avoid this and say new space, and they'll talk about this report and then try to talk about the whole industry. But absolutely, without question, the reason this happened is because of SpaceX. It doesn't matter what you think about Elon Musk, it doesn't matter what you think about anything else. This is just the truth of what changed things on the ground. I think you can make the same argument for Tesla. This is really a question of results, outcomes, efficacy, more than morals or beliefs or values or anything like that. But that's really 100% the truth. And where we are now is we're seeing all of this innovation, and all of it is happening in the United States. So it's almost entirely an American phenomenon. I mean, check this out. Let me show you this. It's almost a joke. We're at a point now where the United States, during the late 2000s and early 2010s, the late 2000s, the United States lost access to space because the space shuttle, basically that program had to be wound down after a second shuttle was lost, and there wasn't really a next move. A lot of plans didn't pan out, and the military rockets that were used were very old. They were expensive. There was a monopoly that had sort of joined together to monopolize the market. Lockheed Martin and Boeing had come together to form a company named ULA to basically just run that market. And once the space shuttle was gone, it actually looked like a very dark time for people who were interested in space and progress and innovation in this area. There was not much going on. You had the Ariane rocket in Europe, you had Chinese rockets, you had Russian rockets, and then you had rockets from the United States that were old, that used Russian engines, and that were basically there to rake in money for defense contractors, which is what it was. And that was sort of the place the industry had moved to. And the reason it shifted is because you had new entrants into the market, and they really changed things up. So where are we now? Well, there's a really great image by a channel that everybody should look at if you're interested in space. This is called, well, I'll just pull it up. Well, there is a channel called Apogee that has, this will work. So here we go. So this is this is image of all of the rockets that are currently being designed or in production in the United States that are medium to heavy lift. Actually, no. Well, there's no Falcon Heavy. It doesn't matter. These are 6 rockets now that the United States has in development that are all private rockets, right? They're not done to government specifications, and they're independently run by, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different companies. They run the gamut. They're all, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them are either partially or fully reusable. This is crazy. This is more capacity and capability in the launch sector, just in the United States. It's going to come online, roughly speaking, in the next 3 years than the entire world has put together. There's 1 rocket in Europe. There's probably, at this point, Russia probably can't even use most of its rockets. That whole thing is going to fall apart very soon. But there's some Russian rockets, and there's a whole set of Chinese rockets we're going to get into. This, though, is bigger than all of them. There's a Japanese rocket, but this is crazy. And all of these, actually, besides Vulcan, all of these rockets are more advanced than anything else in the world. They use different technologies. They have whole different design philosophies, better engines. They have reusability as a concept from the beginning. It's really just remarkable. So this is what I mean when I say that new space is entirely an American phenomenon. There is no major medium to heavy lift rocket being built seriously in any other country that is playing the same game. It's just not happening. The only other country, of course, is China. We're getting into that in a second. And it's actually so bad that these are the companies that are going to make it. I mean, these are the rockets that really have the potential of doing well. There are even more rockets, particularly small American rockets, that are all going to get just obliterated. Either these companies are just going to start ditching them, or they're just going to actually run out of business. Like particularly companies like Astra, they're going to really struggle. And there's a lot of small launch companies that really got spun up in Europe in particular, because it's much harder, it's much easier to build those. Almost all of them can't survive because we live in a world of mass satellite constellations. And we'll see how much we get to talk about that, but these are mass systems with thousands and thousands of satellites. You can't have a small satellite launching up one little satellite. You're never going to have the profits. You're actually just going to go out of business. You're not even playing the same game, to say it again. You're just not. And without that, this is going to be an American phenomenon entirely. And that's the way it looks. Except, of course, for one other country which has a strong opinion on all this, and that is China. Let me bring out this. Oops. So China has a very strong opinion about all this. It does not want the world to just be run by the United States. It does not want here it is. It does not want a world where there's really just America and nothing else. And it's kind of like France in that way. And here's an old image of a bunch of Chinese, these are basically the family of Chinese rocket systems. They're roughly speaking called the Long March family. It's named after a famous retreat maneuver by Mao Zedong during the Chinese Civil War. And China's been in the game with rockets, with satellites for a long time. It has never been as good as the Soviet Union or the United States. It really couldn't even pretend to be much of anything until the 2010s. It was really started taking in, I mean, everyone really interested. I have a great article or series of articles about the Chinese space sector and new space and how all this comes together and what to expect. But basically the Chinese system was a joke in the 90s, started to take in old Soviet equipment, build up its capabilities in the 2000s, really started to hit its stride in the 2010s. And at that point, the US space revolution kicked in, and it basically made all of the Chinese systems and timelines and plans and projects obsolete and basically non-competitive. And there's really no way to right this ship. China tried to institute its own massive new space, tried to encourage a whole host of companies to start producing new modern rockets, just like you saw in the United States. It has not been successful. There are money grabs going on. There's a whole world of very dubious Chinese space companies that are just, they're popping up like flies for a long time. And it's really horrible. And a lot of them are actually just, they're just kind of spin-offs or even directly part of the massive state conglomerates that produce a lot of these technologies. That's a huge part of what's going on. Oh. Well, I appreciate that. The title is from my last episode. Well, I should definitely change that. Let me actually see that. But I appreciate that. Yeah, so this is a whole thing. We're building this as we fly. So if you enjoyed the content, just let me know what's going on. There's definitely things to improve. Deflating the human bubble. Hey, you're right about it. Oh my God, sticks. Well, I appreciate the feedback. It's all going to come together. There's a lot of little changes going on as we start ramping up the production values on all this. But just getting back to it, the country most angry about all this is China, and the whole U.S. system, the recent revolution, obsoleted all of its technologies. And what it's trying to do now, or what it tried to do in the last 5 years, is basically build out a similar revolution to the United States, and it has not succeeded. It has not succeeded at all. What it has basically succeeded in doing is producing really interesting experiments with particularly modern engines. So modern, in particular, methane engines. That is a really key thing that the Chinese private space industry has been sort of conscripted to do. And that has produced some advances, and a lot of this is just going to get folded back into the state military industrial space apparatus. That's kind of the true trajectory of the Chinese so-called private space sector. But the horrible thing, I mean, the really funny thing is that it is fiendishly trying to copy SpaceX, and it is trying to fiendishly copy SpaceX to make its systems viable in the same way. So I'm going to show you something. This was last year at an event in Hong Kong. We all got to see this new slide where, boom. This is a picture. So this is of all those Long March rockets that I talked about. Most of them are old. A lot of them use like really toxic fuels. They land in fields. They're really not the best rockets in the world. That's fine. They have a couple modern ones, and the most ambitious one is notionally called the Long March 9. This is the super rocket. This is the mega rocket like the SLS, the Space Launch System rocket that I mentioned, and also that big Starship that you saw, in the image in the top of this video, as the thumbnail for this video. And of course, I was mentioning earlier, brought up in that other image, these are the big rockets. These are the ones that everyone wants to basically build to develop all these new capacities. And the key change that happened, and is really only getting started, it's only still notional, is the new space companies got to the point, and again, we're talking about SpaceX here, where not just they have the capacity or the potential now to not just make a medium-sized rocket that can launch, let's just say in the, actually, what is it, 20, 30 ton range for the Falcon 9. Let's actually see where it is. This rocket has moved up and around so many times. Falcon 9 payload capacity is around, what is it? 50,000 pounds to low Earth orbit. Yeah, about 18 to GTO. So, yeah, so those medium rockets, we're talking with the Starship, we're talking about a rocket that can bring over 100 tons to low Earth orbit. That is massive. We're talking Saturn V. We're talking the moon rocket at like baby rocket prices. Right? We're talking moon rockets at like small shoot off in your backyard rocket type prices. Not quite, but we're talking small. Yeah, it's basically small launch vehicle prices for mega rocket, moon rocket capabilities. That is where we are, because reusable technologies, if they work for both the first stage and the second stage, they open up a whole new world. And it's a world that we can't even quite fathom, because the whole economics of this industry will have to transform. And that is where things are headed. And that is really the key thing here. Europe is basically going to quickly realize it has no ability to deal with this. Russia can't. Russia hasn't developed a rocket in 25 years. China's the one place that can really try. And so China is trying, and it really unfortunately failed with that whole commercialization push that I was talking about. And the new thing it's trying to do is basically to, actually, you know where I have this? I have a picture of this on Twitter here. Let me pull this up. Yeah, anybody who doesn't, you should follow me on Twitter, where you'll see all sorts of stuff. I mainly comment on things going on in the world and a lot of China stuff, a lot of agriculture, a lot of industry stuff. It is good fun. Let me get rid of this. Get rid of all this here. Oof, you really need these impressive computers these days. Okay. It is so slow, huh? Here it is. Let me take this image. Can I just pull it right out? Oh yeah, that works. Boom. So, I love how you can just put all this up right at once. So here we have, in 1 year, this is the change we have. Oh, it's really cool. I've done this before. Awesome. So this is the Long March 9. The one on the top is the Hong Kong briefing, where they talked about changing the design of the rocket to go from a rocket that has 2 side boosters attached, like the SLS, to a rocket that has a single core with many engines at the bottom. That is the path taken by SpaceX. That's the path that it used in the Falcon 9, and then in its new Starship rocket. And basically everybody's kind of realizing that's a better thing to do. The rockets on the side there, if you look at the top, there's sort of 2, 3, 4 rockets attached to the bottom of the main rocket. Those are typically solid rocket boosters. They add a lot of complexity, they add a lot of expense, and they give you certain capabilities, but they make it much harder to actually make a reusable rocket. And so that's where we were a year ago, and it was a sort of a major change. It means completely transforming the entire architecture for that rocket. It basically means this was really a notional rocket, and now they're going to completely change it, and this is what they have now. This, here, I'll make it big for everybody. If you look, there's the rocket, and that on the top, if you look at the rocket on the right, on the top there, that is a second stage that looks mighty similar to the Starship rocket that SpaceX is building, right? So let's pull up Starship for everybody, just to be able to see. Oh, you know what? I'll give you it in a different image here. So I think it's at the bottom. Boom. Yeah, let's do this one. Okay, so here, this is a graphic from Everyday Astronaut. It's a great space another great space channel with just amazing content. I'll cover my face here. So shout out to Tim Dodd for producing this. I'm going to use it in this comparison here. Actually, let's get rid of this one. And we'll use the other one that doesn't have that at the bottom. Let's try that. Okay, so yeah, that's easier. So here, I'm bringing this up because you can see that on the right is the SpaceX Starship. It's an older version of it with a little bit more claw-like type designs, but it doesn't matter. And then if you look here, you're looking at if you look at those two, they're looking pretty similar, right? So that's what's going on. We obviously have China copying this rocket, and it's copying it and basically changing the plan for its most ambitious rocket, because if its rocket can't compete with SpaceX, it cannot compete with the United States in space. And that's where we are. And this, here, I'll take away this now, just so you guys can see, the Space Launch System on the left and the Starship on the right is a kind of a rehash of exactly what's going on in China. So there, you have the old version of the Long March 9, which has the solid rocket boosters attached. You can't reuse it. It's more expensive, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have the new version they want to do, which looks like this, where here you have the Space Launch System, which also has solid rocket boosters. Rocket booster has a lot of other problems. And then you have the Starship, and the key metrics here to look at is, well, obviously, basically, thrust, basically power, capacity. Those are the two on the left. So here the Starship has way more power and payload capacity. It is much cheaper. So you want the left two bars to be big, and you want the three other bars to be small, and that's exactly what you have. Versus on the Space Launch System, you just have it's extremely expensive for like half the capability, right? That is the story here, where Starship's going to just wipe out the American, the NASA, that early NASA program. We got lucky in the United States. We had a commercial opportunity that let SpaceX build first Falcon 9, and then it actually let it get to the point where it could build a super heavy launch vehicle. And so now we're in this crazy world. And the key thing here, I'm going to start wrapping this up because it's been about an hour, and I've given a lot of information about the space sector. But let's just give some big takeaways here, right? So what does all this mean? The U.S. has this mega rocket that's coming online. It has, with NASA, it also has a mega rocket coming online from SpaceX. And then it has like 3, 4, 5 other rockets coming online that can all do less work but are still extremely capable and very cost effective. Meanwhile, the rest of the world has not much anything. So what we are seeing is that America is really indisputably on the top in the space sector. And what's happening and what's going to happen in the next few years is most of the space industries in most other countries are going to be semi-nationalized. They're going to be brought into the fold of the national government, national corporate structure to try and maintain autonomous strategic capabilities in an increasingly uncertain and dangerous global environment. So the whole heyday of like, let's do whatever the Americans want is fine, or leave China to do this and everything will work out and we can rely on this other country and da-da-da, none of that's going to work anymore. And none of it's going to work anymore because things are really difficult. But the real challenge for countries is that space is still expensive. It is still extraordinarily expensive and difficult. And your country does not have the indigenous history or capability to suddenly build all this out. If you don't have rockets, and you haven't had them for a long time, you're not just going to be able to spin them up in a couple of years. The United States took 10 years, almost 10 years, where it couldn't get its own astronauts to space. And obviously, bringing an astronaut to space is more difficult, but the same principle applies. Building engines takes like a decade to do. It takes about a decade. You can try and cut this down, but you're really screwed. And if you make the wrong choice on your engine, you're in real trouble, right? So you have to make all these right decisions. And if you're just copying other countries, you're always a step behind. And your engineering and design and manufacturing capabilities are not on the same learning curves. They're playing a very different game, and you're never going to be able to keep up, assuming that you can even maintain your system in the first place. But this is where we are. So a lot of things are changing, but the whole satellite industry and the launch industry and most industries that are going to be dynamic and successful, they're moving to the United States. And in a lot of the world, while they're going to try and nationalize things, how do you do that, for example, in Europe, where you have a conglomerate, a bunch of conglomerates basically that run European defense and space and aerospace sectors, And they had to make all these compromises to make these rockets work. And now you have the breakdown of what's going on in Europe. You're not going to be able to create the same systems. France is going to have to try and reconfigure these European systems it builds. Let me show you guys an example. So this is more for later episodes when we talk about the breakdown of the sort of industrial system that we've all come to know in the world today as things really start to take a turn for the worse. It is precisely this sort of thing. Check this out. Oops. Check this out. No? Let's just try that. So right here, this, I'm going to make it big. Everybody can see this. So right here you have the Ariane 6. This is the new European rocket spearheaded by France. And first thing to notice, look at the rocket itself. It has that same structure that we were just talking about as something that you don't want to have anymore. You have a rocket in the center, main rocket in the center, a liquid rocket in the center, and then you have two side boosters that are solid rockets. Already that's a red flag that this is not modern design. And what this map is showing is where all of the different parts of this rocket come from. These rockets are composed of materials and manufactured parts that come from all across Europe. This is a political project. This is not an economically viable system. This actually, the entire Ariane program in a world where SpaceX had vertically integrated within the space launch sector and developed a very compelling, at least 10x better product for a cheaper price, it was never going to survive. The only reason any company actually survived, particularly all the national ones, is because they're supported by their governments. Because, again, they're seen as a strategic asset. And that is the story. So a country like France and a lot of Europe in general is going to want its own indigenous satellite capability and satellite launch capability and the ability to refresh satellites if, let's say, your satellites get blown up. All of this is really changing. So the United States can basically, with something like Starship, put up hundreds or thousands of small satellites quickly, rapidly. It can manufacture them instead of having a satellite be built sort of in a bespoke manner, like a tailored suit for a couple $1,000s from some very fancy Italian man in upstate New York, it is instead very different. So instead of having that really exquisite, precise, expensive satellite construction process, because there's so few of these that get built realistically in the market, the unit economics are so small, that you instead have something very different. You have mass production of satellites. And SpaceX is, again, pioneering this because once it created a reusable capacity in its launch vehicles, it then needed it had to find a use case. It had to find something that you needed to launch in space enough to justify reusing a rocket day after day, one day after the next, even a few hours after the next. And so it's creating this satellite internet constellation, which is going to be extremely successful by all accounts. It's going to pull in a lot of money, and it's going to allow a complete change in how satellites are both produced and then launched, and then what you do even in the creation of these networks. So now you can have lots of distributed satellites that cover the whole Earth, and they're cheaper and they're smaller, but they have better electronics and they're linked together and they're smart. So they're not big and static and vulnerable, but very high quality. They're very different. They're just distributed. They're smaller. They're not as pricey or high quality, but they really get the job done, and they're networked together using sophisticated tools. It's actually a much better framework, and the U.S. military in particular is really worried about basically its satellites getting destroyed. We've talked about this now a couple times in this broadcast, where the U.S. military fears a couple things, but the destruction of the U.S. satellite communications, imaging, and data networks in space would cripple the ability of the U.S. military to conduct expeditionary operations around the world. So most countries, if you're just invading Ukraine, for example, you're Russia and you're invading Ukraine, you don't actually need that sophisticated of a satellite network. You just need to be able to cover Ukraine. I got to watch other countries around the world, but it's a local, regional conflict. That's very different from what the United States does, which is global expeditionary war, where it is all over the world, all of the time. It needs all of the different units and commands and sensors and weapon systems to all communicate with each other everywhere, all the time, rapidly and effectively and seamlessly. The ability to disrupt or destroy that capacity means you can't link all this together. You can't actually have a really compelling, integrated military force that can project force. It's a huge, huge threat. The U.S. military is not crazy. It's not really taking this threat out of context. It's taking the ability of countries to do this a bit out of context, but the actual potential is really there. And so one of the things it's shifted to is this idea of distributed satellites that are shot up en masse, that can be produced en masse, that can be refreshed if they start getting destroyed. That's a totally new concept. And in a hypothetical war with China, for example, where the U.S. had the ability to mass produce satellites and refresh and replenish its military intelligence and information systems, the space systems, and China couldn't do it, that is a capability that could really change the course of a conflict, where one military basically has an integrated intelligence and information and data and communications and image sharing system, and one doesn't. One basically has an internet and the other doesn't. One's going to win and the other isn't. That's the way that looks. It's also really important. One thing people may not know is that something like a hypersonic missile is moving so fast and it's moving so far from where it began so quickly that final tracking for that rocket almost certainly has to come from space. It has to come from somewhere beyond the rocket. So if you start, the second hypersonic missiles start getting fired, a satellite's going to start getting destroyed, because that prevents them from actually executing the mission and actually getting that final kinetic impact, to use military lingo, to get that final kill on target. That is a real, this is something the United States realized in the 2000s, where and even the 90s, you could go back, they realized it a long time ago. This is why the U.S. has been doing this, but really crystallized in the 90s after the Iraq War, in the 2000s during the Second Iraq War, and then afterwards as China expanded its capabilities, that without these systems, things could go really wrong. And so once it realized it was vulnerable to rockets for its carrier groups and all that, it really changed the game, and space became a battlefield. And if you go into the news, they'll talk about space being militarized, and you go to random media sources, and it's just wrong. Space is already a military domain. It began as a military domain, as we started with in this broadcast. And people have kind of forgotten, but that's really where it began. And it's not really going to shift from that. We're actually going to see this crystallize. We're going to see everybody remember that this really is a military domain. And it's really ironic, because everyone was expecting this new space revolution to privatize space, commercialize it. But what's the truth here is that the only place that's getting commercialized and privatized is the United States, which already has the most sophisticated and most advanced and largest space state space sector. Basically the state space sector as well. It has the NASA, the combination of NASA and the U.S. military space infrastructure is the best in the world. And it doesn't produce rockets in the same way that somewhere like China does, but its state capabilities are the best in the world. So you have that, and then you add on all these private companies. And you're just throwing more riches on the winner. This is the Matthew principle at work. This is the rich getting richer, and in a lot of ways the poor getting poorer. So industry writ large is coming back to the United States. And I'm bringing up space because this is one of those iconic industries. This is one of those industries we think of as associated with our modernity, the post-World War II era, where humanity went to space, has gone out of the solar system, has made it to the moon, yes, has made it to the moon, has landed in objects on Mars, has just put up an amazing satellite at a very interesting celestial point. It's an incredible part of our recent story, the last 75 years. So this is a major industry, and the theme on this channel for the next week or so is going to be industry. It's going to be Industry Week. It's going to be industry development. It's going to be a way to help us get an understanding of what industry is. It's not just manufacturing in the abstract. It is the real sectors that make certain capabilities possible in the world. Space is one of them. Space is one of those capabilities. It's one of those technologies that pushes the frontier out. It pushes out what's possible and expands the real reach of human capabilities. That's why it's so important. That's why we're talking about it here and what we're learning. But we've learned in this broadcast, if there's really one key thing, it's that space is a winner-take-all business, and the U.S. is going to take almost everything. And a lot of people, you look back in the 90s, and people were saying the same thing. They said the U.S. was going to take over everything. And you look back to 1945, and this is actually part of a deeper story about why the U.S. is so successful. And that is for other videos, right? Because this channel isn't just about economics. It's not just about technology. It's not just about industry. It's about history. It's about war. It's about the businesses that will survive. And it's also, at its core, about development. It's about why we as a people, as a species, became what we are, and why certain groups among us did better. This is not about race, this is not about ethnicity. This is really about technology and geography. It's about where these are going. And the master technology, in a sense, of our era is one of those technologies that can move us, are the technologies that can move us even farther away from the limits of geographic constraint. So that includes energy technologies like fusion technologies, nuclear fusion reactors. That's a big one. I'm not going to get into whether that's going to happen or whether the pricing or the science or any of that will work out, but stuff like that. And then stuff like space technologies that quite literally move us off the planet. That's a big deal. So it's the start of Industry Week, and the big takeaway that the U.S. is indisputably at the top in space. This is going to be a common refrain in a lot of industries as this global system breaks down. So everyone was talking about the rise of Asia and the rise of the rest, and that's cool. But the only reason any of the rest were able to rise is because the U.S. enabled it. Once the U.S. decides that can't happen, or once the systems it built to make it happen crumble on their own, you can't really have the world that enabled everyone else's success, at least not in the same way, and not to the same extent. So that's where we are. So in a sense, we're back in the 90s. And last time, one of the big worries whenever a country just kind of rises to the top is what's going to happen. In a lot of ways, the U.S. was engaging in navel gazing in the 90s. We had a presidency that was basically totally embroiled. The Cold War ended in 1991, and the whole 1990s was just almost totally fixated on domestic scandals and, what happened in the White House and the Oval Office. That's what people were talking about. And there really was great successes that happened in foreign policy in that time, but it was just a sideshow. America really fell into narcissistic navel gazing. Kudos to Peter Zion for giving that phrase. And the reality is that we are very likely to see something like that again. And the reason we go over on this channel, the technologies that matter, the history we have to understand, the businesses we should keep our eye on, the people that are going to help be major players in all this, is because we want to push things forward. We don't want to just stay locked into our entertainment engines and leave it at that. So this is it, right? Space as an industry is barreling into the future, and a truly transformative new technology of fully reusable rockets looks likely. Greater than 50% chance. The funding is there. The buy-in from NASA is there. The technical capacity. SpaceX is the most capable rocket company that's ever existed. And I don't mean that in some sort of hyperbole. It is, over the last 20 years, its accomplishments and the capacity it's developed within the organization in terms of engine development, systems integration, the AI advances, the software chops, all of this is really world-beating. It's using skills and technologies and tools that were so far from what was available in the 1960s. We can really do something amazing. And we have a company and a partnership with American government agencies, particularly NASA and the military, to start getting really cool things done. But the worry, of course, is, what's really going to happen, because things get dicey. So that's kind of where we are today. I think this broadcast is going to slowly come to an end. I appreciate everybody who listened. Fabulous Third, obviously. Fabius Third, that was great for giving a comment earlier on. Oh my God, Sticks. You're right, I definitely missed that. I think it was probably on Twitch there. Yeah, for both of you. But that is the story. And this was a great broadcast. Like I said, there's a lot of current events going on. There is a whole amount, a pretty crazy amount of things to go over. One of the challenges when you want to give people the view from 30,000 feet about what's going on is that right now, kind of like satellites, there's so many things going wrong all over the world. Doesn't matter if you're talking about regional conflicts or monetary problems or fiscal chaos and collapse in countries or political breakdown or famine or energy shortages or all these things. It's all happening right now at once. So a lot of these videos are going to be comprehensive snapshots or deep dives into key things to know. Other ones are going to give more context on specific areas. So one of the cool videos coming up is I'm going to do another deflation video. Actually, no, let's see if that is coming up when I thought it was. Let's see here. Well, yeah, one of the next videos is actually going to be really cool. We're gonna, well, I'll just give you a quick preview of some stuff coming up, where one of the interesting ones is going to be a further look at what I'm talking about by industrial breakdown. So this is Industry Week. This is where we're going to learn about some of the major industrial technologies and industrial sectors that you got to know, and some of the histories there. And one of the cool ones is just the whole European creation. We talked about with the Ariane rocket, where I brought up how that one rocket is made from like 15 different countries and has all this different stuff. A lot of European industry looks that way. Companies like Airbus are these massive bits and pieces, broken, scattered companies that are trying to get every single company in every single country a little bit of, a little piece of the pie. And that whole structure is really dubious in the world that's coming. And even more importantly, because all that was split out between many companies and many countries, individual countries lost the capacity to do what they need to do, right? They lost the ability to send rockets into space independently of anyone else. They also lost the ability, to be honest, of building their own fighter jets. So that's one story. We have to go back a bit in another episode, another broadcast, to talk about some of the real core industries of industrialization, which was the tool that made all this possible. And industrialization is what gives us industry. So once we understand industrialization and what's going on there, we can get an understanding for what real industry means and where that's going. So that's really cool. We're definitely going to have some talk about China. We're definitely going to talk a bit about the solutions to deflation. Oh, there's a lot of good stuff. And definitely the attention economy, the entertainment engines that are appearing, what's going on with Facebook and TikTok. There's a lot to talk about. And I should say again, one really important thing. So I've been working on this material for a long time, but finally a course is coming together that's going to pull a lot of these threads together that I can't do in a single video or in a single video series or single broadcast or single podcast. There is a course coming out. It's called Map My World, and it's going to go through the deep patterns that structure a lot of the way things are. Really cool. I mentioned at the start of the broadcast. You should check it out. If you don't see soon, I'm going to put it in the description below. I'm going to put a link to the landing page where you can learn more and get early access to this really cool course. Everyone who's listening to this is going to really like it. It is some pretty groundbreaking stuff. It's really cool and it's really accessible. It makes things simple. So it doesn't just throw us information that we're not ready for, puts it out at the right time. So that'll be really cool. And with that, I think we are basically good to go. So everybody, I hope you enjoyed this broadcast. If you did, definitely like, share, subscribe. Keep giving me feedback. Keep giving me the brutal feedback if you must. That's fine. This is how it goes. I'm definitely, the skin is more than thick enough for it. So definitely throw it my way and tune in, because there'll be another broadcast coming your way pretty soon. With that, I am out, and I'll see you guys next time.